Hi, I'm Rebecca from History, Myths and Legends, and today I'm going to talk to you about who could be accused of being a witch. Now, people have been accused of being witches since the Roman period, but it wasn't until King Alfred the Great's reign that it was actually put in writing that you couldn't be a witch. During his time period, in the Anglo-Saxon period, witches were often dealt with locally by lords or through the church, and anyone who was found guilty would have all sorts of punishments from ecclesiastical penance through to death, depending on how serious it was. Now, as over time as laws changed, um, so did accusations against witches. Now, we have to remember that before Romans came, this was a pagan country, and gradually over time it became Christian. And Anglo-Saxon time period was quite difficult because it was quite complicated. As Christianity started to come through the country, there was a mix of pagan rituals and pagan ways mixed and weaved into that. It was a very different form of Christianity to what it turned into in the Hopkins era. In addition, people were becoming more suspicious of their old ways, and so when witches were accused, there weren't many. Most of the witches that were accused were because something terrible had happened as a result of them being witches, rather than them being witches themselves. As we move over time, laws came into place in the Tudor period, and then particularly in the Stuart period under James I, who we know is very, very worried about witches. And laws became much stronger. So rather than looking at witchcraft, they were looking more of just being a witch. So rather than looking at the output, they were looking at them as a person. Now, during Hopkins' period, we have the Civil War, and this compounded people's paranoia about other people. The country was in conflict, and there was lots of deprivation, and people were struggling, and there was lots of stress and anxiety and unrest. And we know that the East Anglia region was very much a Puritan part of the country. They were very pro Cromwell and had Puritan forces, and they in particular wanted to create a very godly area. So anything that wasn't godly in all ways was seen as something bad. We also have to look at the Fens on their own. The Fens has always been a very difficult place to live, and people very much relied on the land. They had to work with the land to survive. They'd spent centuries working and living in a certain way, and there were lots of suspicion that came with that. We know about the light men who, the lantern men who roam the fens to, and you've got to be careful that you don't get pulled into the marshes and drown. And there were lots of suspicions around the marshes. You had to respect them because if you get stuck, then you could get pulled into almost like a mud that's like a quicksand, or when there's a tide coming further up and it impacts on the marshes, you can end up getting stuck. And they very much were in tune with the way that the land works. So they knew when the dry periods would be to use the land, and they knew when they had to rely on the marshes for eels, etc. Their whole lives revolved around it. Now, from James I's reign onwards, the fens have been drained. They tried to drain them from years before. However, a big project was started in James I's era, and there was a lot of resistance against that from locals. So we have the Civil War, we have Puritan religion spreading, and then we also have general anxiety and unrest because people are having to find a whole new way of living and coming to terms with that. So it's not surprising that people started to become suspicious of other people. It was literally a dog eat dog environment at one point. We also have to remember that the science was different. People didn't understand what they understand now. So when we look at the period of time that Hopkins was around, people relied very much on local resources. So they relied on eels and fish, but also on grain. Grain was a real staple part of people's diets. It would make drinks, it would make food, it would feed their animals, it was vital. Now, if you had some mold growing on some grain that you possibly couldn't see, and you made some bread out of that grain, and then people ate that bread and became sick, had hallucinations, or even died, they wouldn't realize that the source was the grain. Somebody had to take the blame. Or if you had a crop that had failed, or there was a disaster, like there was a flood or a drought, somebody would have to take the blame. Now, you could have a really unfortunate situation where you were a travelling person who just went round the fens en route somewhere else. If you stopped in a village and the following day animals got sick because of an outbreak of something unrelated, you could take the blame for that. So, who would take the blame for being witches? Well, basically anyone who didn't fit societal norms. So if you were someone who was an outsider, someone who didn't really mix with other people, somebody who was seen as a bit odd, you could have had all sorts of things going on. You could have mental health problems. It could be that you have really bad anxiety. It could be that you have a disability. Anything that doesn't make you look like the norm from their perspective meant that you were a target. You also had, as time went on, conflict. So if you fell out with your neighbour and you wanted to get rid of them, then just accuse them of being a witch, and the authorities would deal. And it really did get that bad. People did literally say someone's a witch, and they would be arrested and go on trial. Also, people used others as scapegoats. So can you imagine if you had an accident where you accidentally did something and there was a fire and somebody died? You're not going to take the blame for that. Blame somebody else, accuse them of being a witch. They cast a spell. But also there was that genuine suspicion, that genuine fear. That person came over and we had words at the door, and then my child got very, very unwell. I believe they've cursed it. And they genuinely did believe that they had cursed their child. Now, we know, even in Hopkins' era, that there were still old ways mixing in with the new ways, and cunning women were particularly at risk of being accused of witchcraft. So cunning women used healing practices like herbal magic, or what we might even call now Reiki, to heal people. And they were paid well to do what they needed to do. However, if they went to make somebody well and that person got worse and died, then they could then be accused of cursing them. It's a really, really difficult situation, and I don't think we'll never truly understand the mindset of local people, fen folk back in Matthew Hopkins' area, because it's completely alien from how we live today. But there was an element of hysteria. And when you have a group of people who are going through unrest, who are struggling financially, who are struggling to eat, and there is a civil war going on behind the scenes, people turn to other people. And when you've got lots of people talking about something, lots of people will then jump on, and there's a hysteria that develops. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, male or female, because it didn't discriminate. You could be accused regardless of your gender and class. However, 90% of people who were executed for witchcraft were women from poorer backgrounds. So maybe there was a bias towards poorer women being witches. We will never know how many people died as a result of being accused of being a witch. It could be 500, it could be 2,500, and the general consensus is between the 15th and the 17th century are that it was between those two figures. And in answer to the first question, I think anybody could have been accused of being a witch. To begin with, it was very much people who are practicing old ways, people who didn't fit in with what was regarded back then as normal society. But as time went on, hysteria spread. It could be anyone, it could be someone you've just fallen out with. So that answers our next question: who could be a witch? How many people died executed for witchcraft? Well, we don't know. One interesting thing about witchcraft in this country is lots of people think that witches were burnt at the stake, but in England they were always hung. The only reason that a witch would be burnt at the stake is if they were also accused of something else. So, for example, heresy or treason. That would be something that would be worse than witchcraft, and the death penalty, the execution would be burning at the stake for that reason, and you would just happen to be a witch at the same time. However, the majority of people were hung. So, what do you think? Do you know anything about witches? Do you know anything about a witch near you that was executed or even accused? Feel free to comment below, and let's look into some names. So for my next one, we're going to be looking at individuals. We're going to pick some individuals and we're going to be discussing their trials and what happened to them. Thank you for joining me. Goodbye.